The latest Democratic Party debate revealed a division between progressives and centrists in the race for the White House. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Democratic presidential candidates took to the stage to try and convince voters why they deserve to be the party's nominee. Healthcare reform dominated the discussion, along with income inequality and gun control. They also focused on the decision by US President Trump to pull out troops from Syria. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is surging in the polls, was on the receiving end of most attacks last night.
Your signature, Senator, is to have a plan for everything, except this. No plan has been laid out to explain how a multi-trillion-dollar hole in this Medicare for All plan that Senator Warren is putting forward is supposed to get filled in.
And I'm tired of hearing, whenever I say these things, oh, it's Republican talking points. You are making Republican talking points right now in this room.
When I called on Twitter to suspend Donald Trump's account, that you did not agree, and I would urge you to join me.
I don't just want to push Donald Trump off Twitter. I want to push him out of the White House. That's our job.
Join me in saying that his Twitter account should be shut down.
Let's figure out why it is that we have had laws on the books for antitrust for over a century.
Senator Warren said we can't be running any vague campaigns. We got to level with people. We've got to level with people and tell them exactly what we're going to do, how we're going to get it done. And if you...
To discuss the Democratic debate and how next year's election is shaping up, we welcome to our studio the author and journalist Max Blumenthal. Also with us, Joel Rubin is a U.S. former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and President of the Washington Strategy Group. Also in the studio, John Sitilides is a global risk analyst and U.S. government affairs consultant. And joining us from New York, the political analyst and adjunct associate professor of political science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Welcome to all of you. Lincoln, let me start with you in New York. What, if anything, did we learn from the debate on Tuesday night? Did it change in any radical way whom we think has the best policy to run this country?
I think that we learned one major thing, which is in this very crowded media climate, where we are talking about impeachment and talking about Syria, it is very difficult in this very crowded debate stage for anybody to break through. A lot of the kind of tier 2 candidates, Amy Klobuchar comes to mind, even Julian Castro, who had a very good line about guns, Cory Booker, who was always very good in the debates, and the tier 1.5 candidates, Buttigieg and Harris, they all had good nights, but I don't think this is going to move the polls. There's just not a lot of breathing room in the media right now for anyone but the top 3 to break through, so I don't expect this to change much.
Joel, how relevant are these debates? I mean, if we look at the stage on Tuesday night, it was a crowded stage, 12 people. I think that was the biggest debate ever held. And if we look at the issues that we talked about, there was a survey done by Suffolk University. And this is what they found. This is what Democratic primary voters want to talk about. Let's look at their five top priorities: healthcare, immigration, economy, climate change, education. Much of which was talked about. Well, at least healthcare was talked about. But if we look at the bottom 5, okay, look at the bottom 5 there. Look at the last one, election interference. For the past 3 years, what have the Democrats been talking about?
Yeah, no, that's right. And it is not an issue that Democrats did well on in 2018. So they didn't talk about it in 2018. It was all about health care in 2018. That's why Democrats took back the House. And I do think in these debates, though, it's very hard for candidates to, quote, break out. Kamala Harris did in the first debate. She had a real effective line against Joe Biden, got a bit of a surge, but she's leveled off since then. And what we've actually seen as a result of last night's debate is a bit of a muddying of the waters, where the top 3 candidates did well, but they didn't excel. And then the second tier candidates improved a little. And so now we're getting to this space where real political tactics will matter quite significantly. Who's getting out the vote, who's fundraising well, who's building a ground game, who's got the team in place to get out voters in Iowa. And that is really where they're targeting right now.
So we could see changes in the months ahead?
I think we're going to begin to see separation. A lot of it's going to be driven by money and activism and enthusiasm and volunteers and the teams that they're building.
John, looking at that array of 12 candidates on the stage on Tuesday night, and there are also another 9 candidates who didn't make it to the debate. Who, in your view, would be the best and most powerful candidate to take on President Trump next year?
Well, what I think probably isn't as important as what Democratic primary voters think.
Yeah.
And reading Nate Silver's 538 blog today, apparently about 2/3 of Democratic primary voters are wanting to support the candidate that can beat Trump, more than choosing a candidate with whom they share stances on issues. It's a fascinating divide there. So 2/3 versus 1/3. So the focus is who beats Trump. And it's one of the reasons I think why Joe Biden has lasted as long as he has, because he really can't win many primaries. I mean, he's out of sync with most primary voters who were excited by Bernie Sanders, by Elizabeth Warren, by now Pete Buttigieg. But Biden is the one that's seen in a general election as having the best chances of beating Trump. But he can't get to the Democratic nomination. And that's going to be the conundrum, I think, for primary voters, because I think in the end, Warren is the one that really stokes the greatest passion. She's a true believer, and she's also probably one of the toughest fighters around. She won't be intimidated by Trump. But we'll also see what happens when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her colleagues endorse Bernie Sanders this weekend, and see what happens with that mix.
Max, Joe Biden went into this debate with allegations flying back and forth about, well, corruption allegations involving his son when he was vice president. We didn't hear much about that in the debate.
Yeah, but first of all, let me just make an overall comment about the debate, which is a paraphrase of a review of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, which was that it was longer than life and twice as excruciating. This was an incredibly boring debate that would have turned off any normal person who has anything to do, who has children to cook dinner for, who has errands to do. I was bored out of my mind. And so I think that the debate itself wasn't widely watched by people outside of our little bubble.
In fact, I saw some figures which said I think this was the lowest audience for one of these debates.
For good reason, and you just had 12 candidates, mostly speaking in boilerplate. Cory Booker managed to say so many words without saying anything. And so you have Joe Biden. This could have been a good moment for him to take on these allegations. And, you know, his line so far has been, I did nothing wrong in Ukraine, which is totally, absolutely false. First of all, he presided over a regime change operation that transformed Ukraine into the poorest country in Europe while his son was raking in $50,000. So maybe he didn't fire the prosecutor, but Trump is effectively undermining Biden's trust the same way that he did with Hillary Clinton in 2016 with the whole Clinton cash investigation. And then next in line is Elizabeth Warren. And I think she faces a very tough contest with Trump, and he's going to go after her authenticity because she has an issue of racial fraud in her past. Neither of these issues were interrogated in this debate, and I think that leaves both of them to contend with it out there on the campaign trail.
But I think there's a reason why they weren't, and we even did hear it from Cory Booker. One of the key things he says, let's not do the dirty work for Donald Trump. We're not going to litigate in the full public view this kind of fake argument.
I'll get you, Lincoln. Go ahead.
Deal with.
Trump
go ahead, Lincoln.
Trump inoculated Biden for the Democrats attacking him on something on which he's very vulnerable. This has made Biden stronger, which I think actually makes Trump stronger. I would say one thing, everyone on the Democratic side is concerned about electability. I think that's right. Nate Silver's right, and the speaker earlier who said that is right. The one thing we know for sure about electability is that we don't know anything about electability. So this notion that Joe Biden is the electable candidate, we've been told that over and over, but there's no real data to back that up. Joe Biden is uniquely bad at running for president. He's done it twice and failed. Democratic insiders who've been around for a long time don't make good general election candidates. If you don't believe that, ask President Gore, ask President Hillary Clinton, and even ask President Hubert Humphrey. So this notion that Biden is the electable candidate, I think we have to push back on that if we want to be really analytical about it.
And Biden was
any of these
absolutely
candidates,
incoherent.
any of the major candidates, bring a combination of strengths and weaknesses against Trump, who will be a formidable candidate because he has a Republican base absolutely consolidated, and we know that that gets him to about 40, 45 right off the bat. But to think, I'm just not convinced that Biden's the guy on that.
Okay, John, I'll get you in a moment.
Go
Joe,
ahead.
you want to respond to what you just said?
Yeah, no, I think that there's a lot of anxiety right now in the Democratic Party about what last night meant and what the last quarter meant in terms of fundraising, because if you don't have enough money, you don't have enough cash on hand, you can't build a team to execute a field operation and a communications plan that gets you to victory.
Right.
And Biden is lagging even behind Pete Buttigieg. So there's a lot of anxiety. And to that point about what's electable, it's a bit of an unknown. But there is empirical data in surveys. There are polls showing that he has been doing well up till now, but now we've seen polls shift where Elizabeth Warren is taking the pole position. So it is definitely a point that when it comes to the centrists, the mainstream Democrats, right now Biden is looking creaky.
Okay, John?
What's also odd is that after a career of 40 years in politics, that Biden is such a bad fundraiser. You would think, having had the vice presidency behind him, 8 years as President Obama's right-hand man, and President Obama is still wildly popular inside the Democratic Party. Of course, he's not endorsed anyone to date. But Joe Biden is number 5 out of all the candidates in terms of fundraising. So Bernie Sanders has almost 4 times as much cash on hand at $33 million. Warren is up there, and then you've got Pete Buttigieg, and I think as Joel just referenced, even Kamala Harris has more cash on hand than Joe Biden. So it's very unusual that somebody who seems to be quote-unquote electable, at least based on the census, the sense today of Democratic primary voters, is having so much difficulty, A, raising money, and B, disciplining his expenditures. He actually spent more money in the last quarter than he raised. You cannot be a serious candidate for president if you can't show yourself able to raise $1 billion and to be able to spend it wisely. And I think it's going to make a lot of Democratic Party donors increasingly nervous going forward about any large checks to Joe Biden.
Max, I want to get into some of these specifics which took place in the debate. Income inequality. They talked about that. It's a big issue in the United States. Let's listen to some of what was said.
So if you're asking me, do I think we should demand that the wealthy start paying, the wealthiest, top 1/10 of 1%, start paying their fair share of taxes so we can create a nation and a government that works for all of us? Yes, that's exactly what I believe.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Steyer, you are the lone billionaire on this stage. What's your plan for closing the income gap?
Well, first of all, let me say this. Senator Sanders is right. There have been 40 years where corporations have bought this government, and those 40 years have meant a 40-year attack on the rights of working people and specifically on organized labor.
How big an issue is this?
Well, these are the big kitchen table issues that Democrats vote on, especially, you know, in the Rust Belt, in the Midwest, in places where people have experienced outsourcing, where they're facing the opioid crisis. And this is where Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are able to distinguish themselves. And so you actually saw when Warren was talking about a wealth tax, which taxes accumulated wealth, which absolutely, you know, needs to happen. You watched Kamala Harris and pivot to a boutique liberal issue about getting Trump kicked off Twitter. When Bernie Sanders was talking about Medicare for all, you watched Cory Booker and Kamala Harris pivot to another boutique liberal issue on which everyone agrees, abortion, to not address health care. And so you saw Warren and Sanders really stand out, and Warren actually tried to eclipse Sanders by leading the attack on the billionaire class before Sanders was able to make it later in the debate on Biden. So I think Warren actually stood out here, and I think that's probably the takeaway from the debate, is that Warren defined herself as the front runner #1 and also defined herself as the progressive who can co-opt a large part of Bernie's movement.
Right. Lincoln, this issue of income inequality, taxing billionaires, taxing big corporations, is it a vote winner for the Democrats?
Well, it's certainly a vote winner in the primary, and I think it's probably a vote winner in the general. We should note that regardless of which of the 12 people on that stage or is the nominee, or on the very, very off chance that it's one of the 9 others, the Republicans will attack and attack and attack this person on taxes. They will say that if this person is elected, they will have confiscatory tax policies and it will destroy the American economy. That's not a variable, that's always what the Republican Party does. So whether you nominate an Elizabeth Warren, who I think has kind of a groundbreaking tax proposal in the wealth tax, or somebody like, I don't know, Cory Booker, who has a very different approach, it doesn't matter. So, to be concerned of this is too liberal, or this will alienate people, or this will provoke a Republican response, I don't buy it. So I think it is ultimately a vote winner. I mean, I'm a professor, and what strikes me, and I've been teaching at the same university on and off for almost 30 years now, and what strikes me is my younger students, including ones who come from kind of, you know, middle of the road, upper middle class families, are so much more comfortable with progressive tax policies than they were a generation ago. There's something changing, and older candidates, and well, not older candidates in this case, but political insiders and frankly political analysts like myself who've been around for a long time aren't always as attuned to that as we should be. So I'm not so worried about this going into a general election for the Democrats.
Right, Joel, talking about the economy, the investment ratings agency Moody's, they have a sort of election model, which has been pretty accurate in the past. In fact, the only time they got it wrong was in the 2016 election. But their current model...
They're not alone in that.
Right. Their current model shows Trump winning 341 electoral college votes on in the election in 2020, based on the economy. How did the Democrats take Trump on the economy?
Well, what they talk about in the economy is that it's a juiced economy right now, frankly, and that we're watching trillion-dollar annual deficits compounded over time. That's going to leave the kind of burden on our families that is unsustainable, let alone on the personal finance level, for example, student loan debt forgiveness not being addressed, in fact, going the opposite direction. So there are health care. President Trump trying to take away health care, not having any plan for what to do the day after he hacked away at the Affordable Care Act. So there are real economic issues, and I agree with what the professor is saying. I teach graduate school, and the students today are very progressive on these issues. They see the economic difficulties in front of them. President Trump is not engaged in any planning for them, and that's where Democrats have an opening.
But it's a big challenge for Democrats to get those students out to vote, right?
It is, and this is why the mobilization factor matters and the enthusiasm, and Bernie spoke to it last night. You have to have a vision, you have to have someone who excites and mobilizes people, but not just one component of the base and of the party. It has to go across generations.
Sean?
Well, I want to come back on to the survey that you just cited.
I'll get you, Lincoln. One moment. Go ahead.
The survey
John?
that you just cited by Moody's Analytics had three important categories. One was consumer confidence, and that's where Trump scores the highest in terms of the potential electoral college vote. Then there was also the level of the stock market increase since he became president, about 22%. And then lastly was the relatively low rate of unemployment, right? The lowest rate in 50 years. So these are three very clear metrics for average, everyday American voters. So we can talk about progressives and students who are saddled with debt and whatnot, but when we talk about the tens of millions of people who come out to vote on Election Day, these are the critical overriding issues. And on the issues that are important to Democratic primary voters, as we saw last night, I expect Donald Trump not only to attack on taxes, as Lincoln just mentioned, but also Medicare for all, Bernie Sanders, if he's the candidate, capitalism or free market economics versus socialism. And the president already made this issue part of his State of the Union address. So he's already begun to lay out the framing of his opponent, whoever that may be.
Okay. Go ahead, Lincoln.
I would just make a couple of points. First, I wanted to talk about, someone's talking about Biden's fundraising challenges, but another issue here is some of these candidates on that stage have done their work and some haven't. And the ones who haven't are not going to be able to catch up. Amy Klobuchar, I thought, made some very good points, a very presentable candidate, would have been an extraordinary candidate to be the first woman president in 1988 or 1992, because that's where her politics seemed to be stuck, but she hasn't done the work. She hasn't raised the money. She hasn't gone around the country the way she should have. And somebody like Pete Buttigieg has clearly eclipsed her in the polls. The other point I would say is about the economy. The economic indicators are very important. And if I don't know, to pick a name, Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or John Kasich were running on this economy, I wouldn't think the Democrats have much of a chance. I'm not sure that Moody's, because I don't think that the Moody's model right now would predict how badly Trump is doing in some of these swing states where this economy is supposed to be having an impact. The huge Democratic win, or the very big Democratic win in the midterm elections, was much bigger than the economy would have stated. So the Republican Party, and of course the Republican nominee and Republican activists, pay something of a Trump tax at the polling place, which may hurt them, which will hurt them going into this general election.
Max, how important is it going to be for the Democrats to move on from the talking points that they've had for the last 3 years? There was one moment in the debate, and this debate was sponsored by the New York Times and CNN. Both these organizations came under fire from Tulsi Gabbard. Let's watch this.
New York Times and CNN have also smeared veterans like myself for calling for an end to this regime change war. Just 2 days ago, the New York Times put out an article saying that I'm a Russian asset and an Assad apologist and all these different smears. This morning, a CNN commentator said on national television that I'm an asset of...
What do you make of that?
Well, I've been saying from the beginning that Russiagate, you know, while it's supported by so many Democrats, not only was based on a completely fabricated narrative, a complete hoax that Trump colluded with Russia to get elected, and that it would blow up in their faces whenever the Mueller report came down, as it has, that it would blow back on the left, and that anyone who speaks out against the pro-war bipartisan consensus in Washington, as Tulsi Gabbard has, will be branded, as she has been, on CNN by Bakari Sellers, who's a Kamala Harris proxy, and by the New York Times in this practically libelous article they put together, trying to link her to David Duke and the Russian government. They will be branded as a Russian puppet. And, you know, me and many of my colleagues, we're anti-war journalists. We get that same treatment. And so it was very refreshing to see Tulsi Gabbard denounce the McCarthyism that's overtaken the Democratic Party, who behave, the only thing that they have that's different about them, between them and Roy Cohn, is Roy Cohn's mentor.
Joe?
Well, I think it's a bit of a stretch to imagine that all these people are in jail for lying to the FBI about their involvement with Russia, and they were working for the Trump campaign, and there was nothing there.
That's not why they're in jail. That's not why Manafort's in jail.
They're in jail, and
Manafort's not in jail over any Russia-related charges.
Over 100 engagements.
Well, let's just be factual.
Okay.
Over 100 engagements in the Mueller report, engaging with Russians during the campaign. When I ran for office once, if my campaign staff had engaged with foreign governments, I would have said, you're fired. Why? Because foreigners can't vote for you and they can't donate. So something of value was given. That aside, I do agree. I do agree. Wait, we're not going to resolve it here, but I do agree. When it comes to Congresswoman Gabbard, she should not be smeared like that. She has a legitimate position that reflects a significant chunk of the Democratic voters. And for her to take that position, which I don't necessarily agree with, doesn't necessarily mean that she's an asset of the Russian government. That's too far.
I think this hurt Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Well, I'll get to you, Lincoln. Yep, go ahead, Max.
I think this hurt Hillary Clinton in 2016 when she was out there clamoring for a no-fly zone over Syria, which is basically the code for U.S. military intervention. And Trump was the anti-interventionist candidate. And the Democrats have gone so far into this Cold War politics that Trump can go ahead and do it again.
And he faked us out because he's not anti-intervention.
No, and he hired John Bolton.
Go ahead, Lincoln.
One of the results of the last 3 years is that the Democratic Party has become ultra hawkish on Russia. I've done a lot of work in the former Soviet Union, mostly as a scholar over the last, 10 or 20 years. And I was called pro-Russia long before any of you were, because I thought Georgia was not a democracy under Saakashvili. And I was called pro-Russia in Washington and in Tbilisi. So it is, I wouldn't go so far as to call it McCarthyism. It is not McCarthyism. And Gabbard, I think, is trying to thread a needle here. She is a veteran who has an anti-war program, and that should be an appealing combination to voters, right? Somebody who has experience saying, this is wrong the way we keep getting into these endless wars, or regime change wars the way she did it. However, when she combines that with saying there was no involvement with the Trump campaign on Russia, that I don't think that can be said with a straight face. I read the Mueller report. Maybe I'm kind of a nebbishy academic, but I read most of it. I followed this pretty closely. Mueller seemed to say there's kind of a soft cooperation here, but I can't indict, which is different than saying there was nothing. So I'm a little bit hesitant to go down that road. Gabbard is another candidate who is complaining that the system is rigged against her when she hasn't really done the work. She hasn't gone out there and raised the money. I haven't seen her in African-American churches. I haven't seen her in labor halls. And that's how you run for president in the Democratic Party.
John, foreign policy doesn't normally get much attention in these debates, nor in the election, actually. All elections we hear are local. But President Trump's decision to withdraw troops, U.S. troops from Syria, did get some attention in this debate. Let's listen.
What has happened in Syria is yet again Donald Trump selling folks out. And in this case, he sold out the Kurds, who, yes, fought with us and thousands died in our fight against ISIS.
What we were doing in Syria was keeping our word. Part of what makes it possible for the United States to get people to put their lives on the line to back us up is the idea that we will back them up too.
It has been the most shameful thing that any president has done in modern history, excuse me, in terms of foreign policy.
Don't you find it a little, I'll get to you, Max, don't you find it a little bit ironic, John, that it's the Democrats who are now complaining that troops are being brought home?
I don't want to sound cynical, Anand, but it's a great club to beat Donald Trump over the head with right now. While everyone in America, I shouldn't say everyone, mostly people who follow foreign policy and national security are exercised over the execution of this decision, the manner in which it was conducted, and potentially what the outcome is going to be, although we won't know for months possibly years, what the outcome of all this is. But the bottom line is most voters around America are not talking about the Kurds or Syria or Turkey. They don't know who these people are. And Donald Trump did make a promise to the American people that, as he put it, correctly or not, he was going to end what he considered to be these endless wars in the Middle East. And I think the president is really much more focused on other issues. He's focused on the trade talks with China. He's focused on building up the U.S. military in the Indo-Pacific region. And from his perspective, the Middle East is simply not worth expending American lives unless it's on behalf of strategic allies such as Israel or Saudi Arabia. But I think otherwise, he figures it's their fight, let them go at it, and it probably won't affect many voters, at least not in the Republican Party next year.
Max, you're going to tell us now why you were laughing.
You can't say that.
Oh, well, Biden referring to it as the worst mistake ever. I mean, that's classic Biden. But, you know, Hillary Clinton was pursuing a very similar policy. She criticized the presence of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2016 and said, we need to pivot to Asia. That's essentially what Trump is doing. So he removes 300 troops from this hinterland in northeastern Syria. They're not actually leaving Syria, and it provokes this gigantic meltdown. And the one candidate who dares to put it in perspective and talk about it in the framework of a regime change war is attacked the next day by a who's who of the Beltway press corps, again, as a Russian puppet. It's very disturbing.
Yeah, but it is worth noting that today the Congress passed on a bipartisan basis a condemnation of it overwhelmingly. So it's not like it's just the Democrats beating up on Trump.
It wasn't so long ago that George Bush was saying.
But there was another candidate
I thought
who said something very, who had a very interesting moment last night, which was that when Joseph Biden was saying, I've accomplished things, I've done things. And Bernie Sanders, who happened to be standing right next to him because of the way that, you know, the polling numbers are right now, said, you know what you've done? You've done the war in Iraq. And I think that is at least as big a foreign policy blunder as what Donald Trump did this week. And Biden supported it. And that's significant too. And let's put this in perspective. The Iraq war was a pretty big problem.
Is it going to hurt him like it hurt Hillary Clinton, Lincoln?
I don't know. I think Hillary Clinton took the brunt of that. I think it's long enough in the background, and I think people. And Biden is kind of is running as kind of a symbol and backwards, like I can take us back to this halcyon time that never really existed. No one's really going to scrutinize his record all that long ago because people don't distinguish between 1992 and 2002. So I don't sense it.
All right, John, very quickly. I've got 20 seconds.
This congressional resolution would have had a lot more sting to it if the Congress had the guts to vote on whether or not to engage in mission creep in eastern Syria and to fund the Syrian Kurds. They never did so. Or
if it had been requested.
They could have taken the lead on their own the way they did with the resolution. They've had it very conveniently.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.